Good evening. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know there's some logistical things going on, and I really appreciate that you've all come and inviting me here to Philadelphia. 2 summers ago, I was here for a week working on Hidden Figures. I spent every day in the archives at the Townsend Road branch of the National Archives, which has a good chunk of documents from NASA and from its predecessor, the NACA. That archive supplied me with some of the most interesting and critical documents for my research. So it is amazing to be able to stand here in Philadelphia 6 years after that research started with the finished product in hand. When Dorothy Vaughan, the math teacher at the segregated black high school in Farmville, Virginia, which is a city that the whole country knows now because of the recent vice presidential debate, when she traveled to Hampton, Virginia in 1943, she had to sit in the back of the bus. Dorothy headed to Hampton to take a job as a professional mathematician at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, the kernel of what would become NASA, and she would go on to become the first black manager at what was the world's most exclusive scientific club. In the 1950s, Mary Jackson had to apply for special permission just to walk through the doors at all-white Hampton High School after hours so that she could take advanced math classes as part of an engineering training program. She became NASA's first black female engineer, and she very well may have been the first black woman aerospace engineer in the entire country. Katherine Johnson, who turned 98 years old this year. Yeah, pretty amazing. And her memory is still extremely good. She's a remarkable woman. She was born in 1918. Statistically, a black baby girl born that year had at birth a 2% chance of finishing high school, and she wasn't expected to live to see her 35th birthday. But Katherine, from rural White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, went on to calculate the trajectories for the orbital space flight of astronaut John Glenn. That was a moment that tipped the balance in favor of the United States in the space race with the Russians. And Katherine Darden, who was in junior high school when the Supreme Court passed the Brown versus Board of Education decision, making racial desegregation in public high schools illegal, she worried that as a black student attending a school in rural North Carolina with no science lab, only secondhand textbooks, that she would never be able to compete with whites. Yet the software that Katherine wrote as a young engineer at Langley in 1974 is still the industry standard for computer models of sonic boom phenomena. At a time when blacks were legally segregated from whites in all aspects of life, from the schoolyard to the graveyard, when women of all backgrounds were barred in many states from serving on juries or weren't even allowed to take out a credit card in their own name, these black women working as mathematicians at the Langley Laboratory upend all of our perceptions of what it means to be black, to be female, and to be a scientist. Their stories run headlong into some of the most difficult and painful aspects of America's past, but their lives also intersect some of our country's greatest dramas: World War II, the Cold War, the space race, the civil rights movement, and the fight for gender equality. When I started this book 6 years ago, I was writing it for myself as much as anyone. Telling these women's stories was a way for me to take a look at my own life as a professional black woman, as a native Virginian, as a daughter of a NASA research scientist and a Hampton University English professor. I kicked off my book tour in Hampton, Virginia on September 8th, and since then I have been overwhelmed and humbled by the breadth and the strength of the response to Hidden Figures. My parents still live in Hampton, and nearly every day now, somebody drops off a book at their house so that I can sign it the next time I'm home. I used to go home to visit, and they would have dinner ready. Now all they do is sit me down in front of a stack of books and put a pen in my hand. Last month, I was a presenter at the Literary Awards for the Library of Virginia, and I got to sign a copy of the book to poet Nikki Giovanni. As book lovers, you can imagine that was a lifetime highlight. I also got to sign one to Anne Holton, the former Secretary of Education of the state of Virginia, who just happens to be married to vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine. She is also a part of this story. The secondary narrative of my book is all about the battle over integration in Virginia public schools. I don't know if you know, but Ann Holton's father, Linwood Holton, who was the governor of Virginia in the early 1970s, was the one who finally broke the back of racial segregation in the state schools. Virginia fought integration for nearly 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And Governor Holton pushed for integration. He set the example by sending his daughters, including the possible second lady of our country, to an all-black public school in Richmond, Virginia. Hidden Figures is my origin story. The protagonists are black women, and writing about women like me, describing them in the way that I want to be seen, the way all of us would like to be seen, as three-dimensional, fully realized, normal people, produced the book that in many ways I had been waiting to read since I first learned to read. When I was 9 years old, I told my parents I decided I wanted to move to New York and work on Wall Street, something that I actually ended up doing after I graduated from college. So you can imagine my parents were torn between being really excited that they had such a precocious daughter and wanting to conduct an exorcism. I'd been influenced by what is still one of my favorite books, The Westing Game by Ellen Raskin. In my mind, I was the protagonist, Turtle Wexler, a 13-year-old stock market whiz. So inspired by this character in the book, I did what anyone in my position would do. I went to the library and I checked out a stack of books on the stock market so that I could learn what it was all about. The librarian charged all of the books to my card. It was a big stack of books. But when she was done, she looked me in the eye and she said in a very patronizing voice, "Sometimes other people ask us to check out books for them, but we should never, ever do that." I was mortified, absolutely mortified. I thought I was this titan of industry in the making. And all the librarian saw was somebody who couldn't possibly have been interested in reading those books. So I hope that Hidden Figures means that the next curious little black girl with big glasses, which I was, or any girl, or any one of us for that matter, anyone whose dreams and talents, for whatever reason, far exceed the low expectation of the rest of us, the next time that person moves forward to give full rein to their curiosity, the people who receive them will have eyes sharp enough to see them, not as they are, but as they might be. Women of all backgrounds have been so supportive of this book, but men have responded too. So many fathers of adolescent and college-aged girls, many of them and young women in college, particularly in math programs, who may be having a hard time as the only woman in the program, but also a lot of history nerds and airplane geeks and engineers and space enthusiasts who saw their ambitions and their interests reflected in these women. One person candidly told me that he never would have picked up a book that dealt with civil rights and women's history, but the space angle gave him a way into this, and he was so grateful that he had a chance to learn these stories. The black women at the heart of Hidden Figures fought to dismantle the barriers that they faced because of their race or their gender or both. But they also confront the kinds of things that are familiar to all of us: the search for meaningful work, the fight to provide a better future for our families, the restlessness of personal ambition, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the other, the struggle to define what it means to be American. I believe this is a quintessentially American story, with all of the idealism and all of the unfulfilled promises that come with it. But these women and their stories also provide something that our country needs as much right now as we've ever needed it: evidence of the triumph of curiosity and imagination over fear. So often we dispatch the stories of Black Americans or women to separate sections in the national storybook, without acknowledging the fact that these stories are also American history with a capital H. There's a direct line between the lives and the work of the extraordinary, ordinary women that I write about in Hidden Figures and the legacy of founders like Benjamin Franklin, whose fingerprints are still visible in this city and very visible in our national temperament. Franklin was for many years a slave owner and a slave trader here in this northern city, but over the course of his long life, he came to see the practice as an atrocious debasement of human nature, that's a direct quote from him, at odds with Americans' founding ideals and at odds with the spirit of anyone with a legitimate claim to being a humanitarian. He believed in both formal education, he founded the University of Pennsylvania, but his Poor Richard's Almanac was a tribute to practical knowledge and common sense. He was a methodical scientist and inventor who saw the systematic pursuit of knowledge as a necessary element of social progress. How can we look at the facts and circumstances of the lives of the women in Hidden Figures without considering them, like Franklin, as protagonists in that thing that we call the American experiment? Mary Jackson, one of Hidden Figures' main characters, was a Black woman who traced her family roots to the first autonomous free Black community in America, founded in Hampton, Virginia, in the embers of the Civil War. Both of her parents were college graduates. They were fierce believers in the transformative power of education for African Americans. She studied math and physics, but she learned engineering on the job. She was a humanitarian concerned with the advancement of the people in her community, a tireless advocate for STEM education, and a lifelong Girl Scout leader who believed that building alliances among women was a way to break down racial barriers. So what I'd like to do now is to read from Hidden Figures. And this particular chapter is about Mary Jackson, who became an engineer in 1958. And throughout the entire 60s, dedicated herself to wind tunnel research, supersonic tunnel research, which involved taking models of airplanes and putting them at these wind tunnels that would then blast air over the models. And she and the other engineers and mathematicians would then observe these models in the tunnels and use that as the basis for making recommendations of how to improve the planes, to make them more stable, to make them more efficient. So, but this particular chapter takes place outside of work. It's called Model Behavior. Mary Jackson scrutinized every aspect of the model, its smoothness, its symmetry and alignment, its weight distribution, her trained eye and intuition sensitive to anything that might lower its aerodynamic fitness. This had been a project of nights and weekends, but she knew the investigation would provide results much more quickly than any research currently underway in the 4-foot by 4-foot supersonic pressure tunnel. The bar had been set the year before by an engineer in the Aerospace Mechanics Division, Katherine Johnson's group, but Mary and her young collaborator were more than up to the challenge. She was ready to spend all the time it took to help her son Levi build a humdinger of a car to race in the peninsula's 1960 Soapbox Derby. Since the beginning of the year, Mary had spent hours, hundreds of them perhaps, collaborating with her 13-year-old son the way she worked with Kazimierz Sarnicki. This is her work partner. She and Levi had gone to the local Chevrolet dealer to fill out the entry form and pick up a copy of the official rules, which read like a familiarization manual for an airplane. The car and driver together must weigh less than 250 pounds. Only rubber wheels allowed. Length shall not exceed 80 inches. Road clearance must be at least 3 inches with the driver in the car. The total cost of the car shall not exceed $10, exclusive of wheels and axles. They absorbed the restrictions and made sketches and measurements, trying out different designs until they settled on the best specifications. Then they hunted for the materials that would bring their sketch to life. Buried in the clutter at the back of the garage might be a treasure in disguise: vegetable crates, plywood, orphaned wagon wheels, garden tools, old shoes, wire and twine. Just about anything could prove useful to building the car, given enough creativity. Gluing, nailing, screwing, and fitting ensued as the big race, held annually over the July 4th holiday weekend, approached. Mary helped her son refine the vehicle until they possessed something they could roll down the street with its pilot, as the racers were known, in the driver's seat. The final step was to smooth, sand, and polish the body of the car within an inch of its home-built life. All of the Derby's matches started at the top of a hill with no pushing allowed. Levi and his competitors would set off from the 25th Street Bridge in Newport News, Virginia, virtually the only thing that could pass as a hill and the flat as a pancake coastal terrain. As the pilots released their brakes, they hunched themselves far down as they could in their vehicle's cockpit, imploring the gods of gravity to pull them as quickly as possible down the 900-foot race course, hoping to do righteous battle against air resistance, which is as much the foe of the Pee Wee racer as it had been for Chuck Yeager. No one knew that better than Levi's technical consultant, who managed to sneak in the occasional sponsored moment about the wonders of a career in the sciences in the midst of the building fun. An enduring symbol of American boyhood, girls weren't allowed to race until the early 1970s. The all-American Soapbox Derby mixed good old American whiz-bang ingenuity with family fun. The competition had started as a Depression-era distraction, a way to create something out of nothing when nothing was what most people had. Over the years, it had taken hold at the grassroots, and in 1960, Levi was one of 50,000 boys gearing up to compete in local races around the country. Not surprisingly, the peninsula embraced the competition with zeal. Parents who spent their days designing, building, fixing, and operating machines of transportation signed their sons up and gave free rein to their own tinkering instincts. They got to spend time with their children and let the parental mask slip just a bit, giving their offspring a glimpse of the curious child they themselves had once been. Officially, the Derby was the boys' show, from building the car to crouching inside it on race day. Parents, usually fathers, Mary was one of the very rare Derby moms, were supposed to stand back and offer only advice, but it was usually hard to tell who savored the engineering project more, the parent or the child. Like craftsmen in a medieval guild, the NASA engineers hoped that one day their children would decide to take up the mantle of the profession they held so dear. Their workplace was pleasant and safe. Their colleagues were smart and interesting. And over the course of the 20th century, engineers had seen the fruits of their labor transform every aspect of modern life in ways that seemed unimaginable, even as they were happening. They wouldn't get rich, but an engineer's salary was more than enough to crack into the ranks of the comfortable middle class. So they served as laboratory assistants for science projects and turned the kitchen table into an honors calculus class. They held their offspring captive until the last homework problem was solved correctly. Adolescent insolence and tears be damned, and I can attest to that personally. No NASA father had anything on Mary Jackson. Building a Soapbox Derby car was an apprenticeship in engineering, and the earlier a kid got started, she knew, the more likely they were to fall under its spell. She pushed Levi, and his teachers, of course, to allow him to take the most challenging math and science classes he could handle, and she coached him on his science projects. His 8th grade project, a study of airflow in scaled dimensions, scored 3rd place in his school's annual science fair. Soapbox what? Some neighbors and Bethel AME parishioners and Girl Scout troop members had asked when Mary told them about her and Levi's mechanical exploits. The first challenge many blacks faced in participating in something like the All-American Soapbox Derby was finding out about it in the first place. Starting early in the year, Chevrolet placed advertisements in Boys Life magazine, the official publication of the Boy Scouts, exhorting youngsters to put in their bid for fun, fame, and adventure by getting their cars in tip-top shape before racing season rolled around in the summer. Levi, who was a member of Bethel AME's Boy Scout troop, this is one of the local churches in Hampton, might have read about the Derby even if it hadn't been part of the water cooler conversation in his mother's office, but the message had a hard time finding its way to less well-connected ears. Harder than getting the message, perhaps, was acting on it when you got it. Entering the Derby was tantamount to believing you had a shot at victory, as much or more for the parents as for the racer. The electrified fence of segregation and the centuries of shocks it delivered so effectively circumscribed the lives of American blacks that even after the current was turned off, the idea of climbing over the fence inspired dread. Like the editorial meetings in 1244, these were the meetings that Katherine Johnson went to at work. Like so many competitive situations, large and small, national and local, Black people frequently disqualified themselves even without the whites-only sign in view. There was no rule keeping a Negro boy from entering the race, but it took a lot of gumption for him to believe that he might win, and even more to accept a loss as a failure that had nothing to do with his race. Mary, however, was determined to clamber over every fence she encountered and pull everyone she knew behind her. The deep humanitarianism that was her family inheritance had taught her to see achievement as something that functioned like a bank account, something you drew on when you were in need and made deposits to when you were blessed with a surplus. Langley, full of talented people with varied interest, was a bonanza of recruits for her many volunteer activities. Coworkers got used to finding Mary standing quietly at their desks, enlisting them in her latest attempt to apply the engineer's values of discipline, order, and progress to the social sphere. Girls, she believed, needed particular attention. It wasn't lost on her that the Derby, while open to Black boys, would have rejected her daughter's application because of her gender. Mary's promotion to engineer gave her an unusual vantage point. Despite the relatively large group of women now working at the center, most female technical professionals, Black and white, even someone as gifted as Katherine Johnson, were classified as mathematicians or computers, ranked below engineers and paid less, even if they were doing the same work. Mary made common cause with the Black employees working at Langley and at other places in the industry. She and Katherine Johnson and many others were core members of the National Technical Association, the professional organization for Black engineers and scientists. Mary made every effort to bring students from Hampton's public schools and from Hampton Institute into the Langley facilities for tours to get an up-close and personal look at engineers at work. She organized an on-site seminar for career counselors at Hampton Institute so they might better steer their students into job opportunities at Langley. If she got word that Langley was hiring a new Black employee, she went out of her way to make phone calls to find him or her a place to live, just as she had done during the war when she was the secretary of the King Street USO. But Mary also cultivated allies among the white women she worked with. Emma Jean Landrum, another member of Langley's tiny engineering sisterhood, sat a couple of desks away from Mary in the 4-foot supersonic pressure tunnel office. Emma Jean was valedictorian of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro's class of 1946, and back then it was the largest all-female college in the country. Working her way through school, serving meals in the dining hall, and grading papers for professors. Like so many of the women at Langley, Emma Jean had been recruited by Virginia Tucker, the former head computer at Langley. In the years since, Emma Jean had produced several research reports as part of the Unitary Plan Tunnel team. She then transferred to the 4-foot supersonic pressure tunnel office, where she became another of Cass Sarnicki's frequent collaborators. She, like Mary Jackson, had become an engineer in 1958. When Mary asked Emma Jean to participate in a career panel in 1962, organized by the local chapter of the National Council of Negro Women, Emma Jean readily agreed. An all-Black group of junior high school girls paid close attention to Mary and Emma Jean's joint lecture entitled "The Aspects of Engineering for Women." Afterward, Emma Jean entertained the girls with a slideshow from a trip she'd recently taken to Paris and London. Their parents together in front of the group, Mary, petite and Black, and Emma, white and nearly a foot taller, made a powerful statement on the possibilities of the engineering field as their actual presentation. Not only did the girls receive firsthand evidence that women could succeed in a traditionally male field, in Mary and Emma's collaboration, they also saw that it was possible for a white workplace to embrace a woman who looked like them. Serving as the leader of Girl Scout Troop Number 60, now one of the largest minority troops on the peninsula, was always the top of Mary's list of volunteer activities. However, she was becoming impatient with the segregation that mandated a separate council for Black Scouts, and she began campaigning for one organization overseeing all of the Scouts. When nominations circulated to fill Virginia's 2 slots for the Girl Scouts National Conclave in Cody, Wyoming, Mary lobbied to send her young assistant troop leader, Janice Johnson, who had developed into a capable right hand and a leader in her own right. This would be Janice's first time in an integrated setting, her first time away from her hometown, in fact, but Mary believed that she would be up for the challenge and find it an invaluable experience. Mary also knew that a native of a place so flat that it was practically underwater would need a leg up before hiking for days in the rarefied altitude of the Wyoming mountains. So Mary enlisted the help of Helen Mulcahy, a former East computer who had transferred to Langley's technical editing department. Mary asked Helen, an aficionado of the outdoors, to take Janice trekking with a full backpack, first on Buckrow Beach and then up into Virginia's Shenandoah Mountains. It wasn't exactly the most rigorous training for an excursion at 5,000 feet, and Janice didn't earn any badges for her hiking, but she did hold her own in the camp and returned with tales for her young charges and a head full of dreams of a life beyond her Tidewater home. With each passing year, it seemed that the work that Mary loved and the community service that gave her life meaning were becoming one and the same. She earned her engineering title through hard work, talent, and drive, but the opportunity to fight for it was made possible by the work of the people who had come before her. Dorothy Vaughan had had a positive impact on her career and on the phenomenon in waiting that was Katherine Johnson. Dorothy Hoover had shown that a Black woman was capable of the highest level of theoretical aeronautical research. Pearl Young, Virginia Tucker, Kitty Joyner, Mary stood on those white women's shoulders too. Each one had cracked the hole in the wall a little wider, allowing the next talent to come through. And now that Mary had walked through, she was going to open the wall as wide as possible for the people coming behind her. On Saturday morning, July 3rd, an enthusiastic crowd of 4,000 people crowded along both sides of 25th Street in Newport News, kicking off their 4th of July holiday weekend. The weather was Virginia summer at its best, clear, warm, just enough of a breeze to keep the crowd from overheating, not too breezy to interfere with the outcome of the peninsula's 10th annual Soapbox Derby. Contestants for the first heat of the day wheeled their vehicles to the starting line at the summit of the 25th Street Bridge. Everything receded into the distance as the pilots settled into their cars. The view of the C&O coal piers and the shipyard below, the sound of the energetic crowd, the faces of family and friends who had come to cheer them on, everything except the feel of the vehicle confining their gangly limbs and the desire to be the first car across the finish line. Officials weighed and inspected each car and then held a lottery to determine the positions in the first heat. At the crack of the starter's pistol, the pint-sized pilots released their brakes, hunched down into their homemade roadsters, and willed their cars down the hill. The race was an all-day affair, heat upon heat, of anxious and eager adolescent boys soldiering on through wobbly wheels, broken axles, driver errors, parental disappointment, and photo finishes. Mary Jackson could see the air moving around the racer just as clearly as if she were looking at a Schlerin photograph taken in a wind tunnel. Levi's car was well made. The only adjustment it required between heats was a drop of oil on each wheel bearing. Mary and Levi Sr. and 4-year-old Carolyn held their breath as Levi Jr. got into position for the final heat. It seemed like an eternity, but at the end, Mary and Levi Sr. shouted in delight. Their son had finished first, saving his best time for the heat that mattered most. Wearing a black and white crash helmet and the official race t-shirt, Levi Jr. sailed across the line at a relatively blazing 17 miles per hour. His family fell upon him in a crush of hugs and celebration. To the inquiring and surprised local reporters who came to hear from the winner of the Virginia Peninsula Soapbox Derby, Levi Jackson confided the secret of his victory, the slimness of his machine, which helped to lower the wind resistance. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" the Norfolk Journal and Guide reporter must have asked. "I want to be an engineer like my mother," Levi said. The spoils of the win were eye-popping. A golden trophy, a brand new bicycle, and a spot at the National All-American Soapbox Derby in Akron, Ohio, as the official representative of the Virginia Peninsula. There, Levi would face off against pilots from around the country in front of 75,000 fans on a track where the racers could dash along at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. There, he would be the only occupant of his aerodynamic buggy, but he'd have a community of people riding along on his shoulder. Levi Jackson was the first colored boy in history to win the Peninsula Soapbox Derby. Virtually the moment he crossed the finish line, the donations started rolling in from the Bachelor Benedicts, the Phoebus Elks, the Beau Brummel Social Club, the Hampton Women's Service League, half a dozen local Black-owned businesses, and each of Hampton's 3 largest Black churches to help defray the cost of the local hero's trip to Ohio. Another Black first for the books. If a Black kid could take home the Soapbox Derby trophy, what else might be possible? Achievement through hard work, social progress through science, possibility through belief. When Levi reached out and took hold of the first place trophy, Mary witnessed, in one proud and emotional moment, the embodiment of so much that she held dear. Of course, Mary also knew her son was a ringer. The two of them had been building to win. Brainbusters kids were supposed to come out on top in a race like this, even if the brainbuster was a woman or Black or both. Being part of a Black first was a powerful symbol she knew just as well as anyone, and she embraced her son's achievement with delight. But she also knew that the best thing about breaking a barrier was that it would never have to be broken again.
I haven't read the book yet. I did purchase it as soon as I saw that it was on Amazon, so I pre-ordered it. And I wanted to know why the publisher did not include any photographs.
That's a good question. Because of the timelines, this had to do with sort of production and legal, and because of the timelines, there wasn't enough time to include the photos in the book. But there will be a paperback version coming out next year. So there's a special movie tie-in edition of the book, which is also on kind of a fast forward, but there will be like the final paperback version of the book, and that will have photographs in it. So yes, good question.
First of all, thank you, Ms. Shetterly, for writing this book. Thank you for all the years of research that you put in. The thing that I would like to ask you is, how did you initially get motivated and interested in putting something like this whole framework into writing?
Well, it's an interesting story. So as I mentioned, I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. My dad is now retired. He's a research scientist who spent his entire career at the Langley Research Center, where the story takes place. And so the women in the book and more were people that I knew growing up. They were people that were my parents' friends. They were, Sunday school teachers and neighbors and people that you'd see in the grocery store, parents of people I went to school with. And so I kind of took it for granted. I'd go to NASA to visit my dad at work, and I'd see these women, but it never occurred to me to really ask why there were so many women there, or why there were Black women there, or, it just seemed kind of part of the whole normal scheme of things. And then it was 6 years ago, my husband Aaron, who was here, we went home to visit my parents over Christmas, and had seen a Sunday school teacher that day, and then my dad was sort of talking about her. She had worked as a computer there at Langley, and he was talking about her and about Katherine and all these women and this work that they had done. And my husband was the one who said, I can't believe, wait, what is this story? Which it's like, this is a story about a huge group of women who were professional mathematicians, a number of whom were Black during segregation, and nobody knows about this, And so for me, it was a moment of saying, well, geez, maybe I don't really know about this. I have no idea why they're there or how they got there or when they started getting there. And so The first interview was with a woman named Kathleen Land, who died about 3 years ago, I guess. She was 96 years old. She had been a computer. Then Katherine Johnson, and Katherine Johnson first told me the name Dorothy Vaughan, who was a name I'd never heard. And so it was just sort of stepping back, making these connections from one story to the next, and then digging the archives and looking for the archival evidence of these women and their work. And it just, I just had to figure out where it all began, the story, where it started. Once I started looking at this history, I couldn't stop until I got to the bottom of it. So that's what happened.
Did Mary ever meet Wernher von Braun or have any opinion about him?
She didn't. So Wernher von Braun, so I don't know if people know, but so Wernher von Braun was a German rocket scientist who, after World War II, a number of the German rocket scientists came to the United States. A whole other group of them went to Russia. So he actually was at the Marshall, what became the Marshall Space Center in Alabama. So she did not actually work with him and did not meet him. To my knowledge, neither did Katherine Johnson. A number of the engineers, the high-level engineers like John Becker and John Stack, and a number of the guys who worked in the space side of things did, but Mary and Katherine, to my knowledge, did not meet him.
Who motivated you to write this book?
Well, I think the motivation was really trying to, more than any individual person, although the women that I got a chance to meet and write about were so inspirational and interesting, and I learned so much from them. I think it was more a motivation of trying to figure out a lot of questions for me about how I grew up and who I was, how my parents had sort of moved from, this world of segregation that their parents had grown up in to a world where, I felt that, I got to go to the college I wanted to go to and had this, entirely different set of possibilities than they did and then their parents did. So I think it was, the motivation was really kind of trying to understand a lot of these things about what it means to be American, what it means to be Black in America, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a professional woman. So I think it was sort of a way of figuring out who I am without having to write about myself, maybe. Well, if you ask Katherine Johnson that question, and I've asked her, everyone asks her that question of like, were you aware of this weight of history? Were you aware of, did you have a sense of something, doing something in that moment that was extraordinary or excellent? And, and she says, well, I loved my job. I always did my job very well, but I was just doing my job. We were all just doing our jobs, and I think it's really hard, like 50 years from now, maybe people are going to be like, wow, those people were convened in that room and they had no idea that they were making history, whatever it is that we're doing right now. And, I think it really does take time and space and distance from things to see it as history, even as, we go to bed at night and we wake up the next day and what we did yesterday is history, and what all of us do is history. But I think that they saw themselves as participating in this very exciting and history-making endeavor, but I don't know that they saw themselves as, in that moment, as sort of agents of history.
Were they forthcoming with, did you have any trouble with getting people to talk?
No. Yeah, they were very, I get emails on a regular basis from the women, their families, sometimes talking about, did you know that my mom or my grandmother or was a computer, or, sometimes the women themselves saying, oh, I worked here during the 1950s or whatever. But what is also true is that during World War II and during the space race and during the Cold War, a lot of the work that they did was classified. So ranged from sensitive to various levels of classified. So there was definitely they worked in an environment where they were not encouraged to talk about the work that they did.
Hello.
Hi.
It just so happens that I'm going to be doing a workshop in about a week on microaggression. And I'd like to quote you on that statement you made, if you don't mind, but I didn't get it all. That the librarian said to you about,
Yeah.
because that's a very,
Right, yeah.
so that's not in your book, that's on your paper, right?
Yeah, it's just, you feel free to.
I just didn't get it all. Could you give me a sense of what you said?
Yeah,
again?
just that the librarian, told me that one should never check out books for other people.
For other people. And how old were you at the time?
9.
Thank you.
My dad and, this sort of group of, so my dad started at NASA in 1966 and retired in 2004. Is that right? 40 years. Anyway, so he is like Mr. Science Advocate. So, friends and family and people come to the house, and there's like some 10-year-old kid, and he's sitting there cornering them, telling them, that they really need to do their calculus and become a scientist. He's got like this super exuberance, and that was absolutely true for, Mary Jackson and Katherine Johnson. Like there was this whole cohort of Black scientists and engineers and technical people who saw there was no conflict whatsoever between being sort of like the geeky NASA person and being the person who went to the Panhellenic Council dance on Saturday night. There was never any, distance between that. So I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that there are a lot of groups that are doing things to change that, like a lot of younger organizations like Black Girls Code and, and maybe, I don't know, it seems that perhaps there's also an issue that although there are more, people of color, there are more women in these fields than, there were 30 or 40 or 60 or whatever years ago. For some reason, they're still not being seen. I think there's a problem of actually in the Black community, seeing these people who are doing this really interesting work and important work and love their jobs. And so, I don't know, I think maybe it has to do with showing people, the people who are already there, and that they don't have to sacrifice the other parts of their identity to have this really interesting career, and that they love it, that this is it's really cool and interesting work. It's not boring, that it is exciting. And I think a lot of the organizations like Black Girls Code and, things like that is designed to be cool and be interesting. The Girl Scouts are doing a lot in terms of STEM work, I think. So I think it's a matter of connecting with these organizations that are showing that you don't have to be, whatever this idea is of an Einstein nerd, this sort of stereotype that people have of a scientist, that anyone can be a scientist, which is to say, I don't know the answer to that question, really.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. The historian Ivan Van Sertima some years ago did major work on blacks in science, ancient and modern. Do you see the opportunity, but it hasn't been really revealed to the public? He did the book and then he did, presentations. How do you see that your book and the movie can be a way of launching this subject matter, that would allow for the greater field of blacks in science to give broader exposure, because it's immense in terms of inventions between inventions and contemporary work that Africans have done in science is amazing.
I hope so. I mean, the idea that there's this movie that's being made of these women who were, extraordinary people, but ordinary. I mean, they took care of their kids. They, played bridge. They had lives. Like, they did not sacrifice full and enriching and interesting personal lives for having this career. And so I think the idea that this movie particularly, because I think, as much as people read books, more people do see movies, and movies are, the impact is so strong and so visual, that maybe they'll be like, wow, this is totally normal. Like, this idea that, like, you can just have this movie that's sort of this big sweeping historical thing, and at the same time, these are kind of people that, like at the church picnic or, at the PTA meeting, that they're not so removed that you cannot imagine yourself being those people, and I think maybe that goes to what we were talking about before. I mean, these are people, you can be these people. Like Katherine Johnson, I mean, she is an exceptional, brilliant, like in just so many ways person, but at the same time, she is someone who walks among us, I mean, this is not somebody who is so distant that if you are someone who aspires to become a mathematician, you can't see yourself starting at point A and ending up where she is. So I hope that does help.
Yes, good evening. How did the adaptation to film transpire? How did that occur?
So what happened is I wrote a book proposal. So writing, I would like to write a book about this, and found a literary agent, very smart. I think she might even be here, so Mackenzie. Oh, there she is. So my literary agent is here. You can ask her more questions. Her name is Mackenzie Brady Watson. And Mackenzie saw the book proposal and liked it, said, this is really interesting, and agreed to represent me, and found a publisher for the book. And she then found the movie people, the people who were interested in producing the film. There's a lady whose name is Donna Gelati, who is the producer, who read the story. She's super enthused by stories of strong women. She's one of very few very powerful women in Hollywood, and it just resonated with her. So she actually optioned the book proposal. So I was actually working on the book while the movie was in progress, which is not a very usual circumstance, highly unusual circumstance actually, and that's what happened. It's sort of from the very beginning. I think the power of these women's stories has just been like opening door after door, and the response has been just amazing. So that's why the book is here and the movie is almost here. So I guess that is the end, unfortunately, of the questions.